The evening was quiet, almost too quiet, as the final rays of sunlight bathed the kitchen in a golden glow. Elisa stood at the stove, stirring a pot of spaghetti, the familiar scent of garlic and basil filling the air. It was a scene that had played out countless times over the years. Lucas would come home from work, kiss her on the cheek, the kids would laugh and chatter at the dinner table, and they would share stories of their day. A perfect, simple life. Or so it seemed. But tonight, something felt different. Elisa couldn't quite put her finger on it, but a nagging sense of unease settled in her chest, heavy and uncomfortable. She glanced at the clock, 6:45 p.m. Lucas should have been home by now. He was always home by 6:30, without fail. Punctuality was his thing, part of the order and discipline he prided himself on. As she turned off the stove, ready to call the kids down for dinner, she noticed something out of place on the counter. Lucas's phone. It lay face up, screen dark, but she could tell by the angle it had been tossed there in haste. Her brows furrowed. Lucas never left his phone unattended. In fact, he was annoyingly attached to it, always checking emails or responding to messages. She had teased him about it before, calling it his third arm. Her fingers hovered above the phone for a moment. She didn't want to invade his privacy, but the feeling of dread gnawing at her refused to let go. Maybe it was nothing, a work email he'd forgotten, or maybe a text from a colleague. Still, the temptation tugged at her, and before she could stop herself, she picked up the phone. The screen lit up instantly. Her heart sank. A message flashed on the screen, sent just minutes ago. Miss you. Can't wait to see you again. The sender's name at the top made her stomach twist into knots. Camila. For a moment, Elisa's mind went blank. She blinked, rereading the message over and over as if the words would somehow change. Camila. Her sister. Her own flesh and blood. What was she doing texting Lucas, her husband? That kind of message. Her breath caught in her throat, and the room seemed to spin for a moment. It had to be a mistake. Some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe. Before she could convince herself otherwise, her fingers moved on their own, scrolling through the conversation. Each swipe of the screen revealed more messages, each one like a dagger plunging deeper into her heart. I miss you too. Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you. When can I see you again? You're all I want. Elisa's vision blurred with tears as the truth hit her like a freight train. Her husband and her sister, two of the most important people in her life, were having an affair. The reality of it was so staggering that she almost dropped the phone, her hands trembling violently. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was her life. Everything she had built, everything she had believed in, falling apart before her eyes. Suddenly, the front door creaked open, and she jumped, quickly locking the phone and placing it back on the counter. Her heart pounded in her chest as she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. She had to keep it together. Not here. Not now. Hey, honey, Lucas's voice echoed from the hallway. She heard the familiar sound of him kicking off his shoes, the clink of his keys as they landed in the bowl by the door. His routine was so normal, so painfully normal, that it almost made her sick. Elisa took a deep breath and turned to face him, forcing a smile. Hey, she said, her voice wavering slightly. Lucas walked into the kitchen, his tie loosened, and a relaxed smile on his face. He leaned down to kiss her on the cheek, the gesture so automatic it felt rehearsed. How was your day? He asked, moving to the fridge to grab a bottle of water.
Her throat felt dry.
Fine, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. How could he act so normal? How could he walk in here like everything was perfectly fine while he was living a lie behind her back? Lucas didn't seem to notice the tension in her voice. Where are the kids? Upstairs, doing homework. I was just about to call them down for dinner, Elisa said, her mind racing. She couldn't confront him. Not yet. Not like this. She needed time. Time to think. Time to figure out what to do. Time to process the earth-shattering betrayal that had just blown her life apart. Lucas nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. He glanced at the table, then back at her. Smells great, babe. Spaghetti, right? She forced a nod, her stomach churning.
How could he act like this?
How could he stand here, smiling, joking, pretending, after what she'd just seen? "I'll call the kids," Lucas offered, heading for the stairs. Elisa watched him go, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. The urge to scream, to shout, to throw something surged through her, but she swallowed it down. The kids didn't need to see this.
Not yet.
She needed to protect them from the chaos that was about to engulf their world. As Lucas's footsteps faded up the stairs, Elisa slumped against the counter, her chest heaving with silent sobs. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions. How long had this been going on? Why Camila? Why now? What had she done wrong? Was their entire marriage a lie? Every kiss, every "I love you," every promise they had made, had it all meant nothing? The weight of it all threatened to crush her. She wanted to run, to scream, to confront Lucas and demand answers. But fear held her back. Fear of what those answers might be. Fear of what this would do to her family. To Sophia and Ben. They were just kids. They didn't deserve this. None of them did. But as much as Elisa wanted to shield her children from the pain, she knew she couldn't keep this secret forever. She couldn't live with this lie festering inside her, poisoning everything. The truth had to come out eventually. She just wasn't sure if she was strong enough to face it. For now, though, she had no choice. She had to play the part. She had to keep pretending, at least until she figured out her next move. Elisa wiped her tears, straightened her posture, and forced herself to breathe. The scent of spaghetti filled the room, but the once comforting aroma now felt nauseating. She turned off the stove and set the pot aside, her mind numb as she moved through the motions of preparing dinner. The sound of her children laughing upstairs echoed faintly, a painful reminder of the fragile illusion she was desperately trying to hold together. But deep down, Elisa knew that this was only the beginning. The cracks in her perfect life had turned into gaping wounds, and soon, the entire facade would come crashing down. As she set the table, her hands still trembling, she whispered to herself, "What now?" She didn't have an answer. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed Elisa's discovery were a surreal blur. She moved through her life like a ghost, doing what was expected of her. Cooking, cleaning, working, caring for the kids, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped in a web of confusion and heartache. The shock of what she had uncovered hadn't fully settled, but the sting of betrayal hovered like a dark cloud over her, suffocating her with each passing moment. Lucas hadn't noticed. He went about his routine the same as ever, kissing her goodbye before work, texting her throughout the day about dinner plans. Every time his phone buzzed, Elisa's heart clenched with dread. Was it Camila again? Another secret meeting? Another lie? She hadn't confronted him yet. Somehow, she couldn't bring herself to do it. Not because she was afraid of what he'd say, she already knew the truth, but because she wasn't ready for the fallout. Once she spoke the truth, everything would change. Their family would be shattered, and the life they'd built would come crashing down. And what about the kids? What would this do to them? That thought kept her paralyzed. Sophia and Ben had no idea their world was teetering on the edge. 14-year-old Sophia, already a moody teen, had been more distant lately, locked away in her room. Ben, 7, still ran to his father's arms every night when Lucas came home. How could Elisa destroy that? The secret was eating her alive. Every glance Lucas gave her, every touch, felt like a lie. It was as if an invisible wall had sprung up between them, a barrier built of lies and deceit that no amount of pretending could tear down. It wasn't just Lucas's betrayal, it was Camila's that cut deeper. Her sister. They had shared everything since childhood, been each other's confidant. Elisa had trusted her more than anyone. And now this? How could she have been so blind? One evening, while Lucas was in the shower and the kids were watching TV upstairs, Elisa gave into the temptation that had been gnawing at her. She unlocked his phone, her fingers trembling, and scrolled through the messages. With each word, the knot in her stomach tightened. "You looked so beautiful last night. I wish we had more time. I hate sneaking around, but I can't stop thinking about you. I'm falling for you, Lucas." I've never felt this way before. Her hands shook as the truth sank in deeper. Camila was in love with him. This wasn't just a fling. It was something deeper, something that had been growing for months. Elisa had been living in the dark, unaware that her sister was tearing her family apart. She scrolled further, looking for answers. When had this started? How had it happened? She found it. I can't believe this is happening. You're my sister's husband. I know. I never meant for this, but we can't stop. I can't stop thinking about that night at the cabin. No regrets. The cabin. It had started during that family trip last summer. Elisa remembered it clearly. Camila had been there, of course. They'd all shared drinks around the fire at night, the kids playing by the lake. It had seemed perfect. How had she missed the signs? How had she not noticed the lingering looks, the secret smiles, the touches? The bathroom door opened. Lucas stepped out, steam curling behind him. Elisa jumped, locking the phone and placing it back on the counter. Her heart pounded as she tried to act normal. "Dinner smells great," he said, toweling his hair. Elisa could barely force a response. She felt sick. She had to get out of there, away from him. She couldn't stand being in the same room as him, not now. "I need to go for a walk," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. Lucas looked at her, concerned. "Are you okay? You've been off lately."
Off.
If only he knew. "I'm fine," she lied, grabbing her coat and rushing out before he could ask more questions. Outside, the cool air hit her like a slap, but it didn't calm her racing heart. She walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, her mind spinning with thoughts of Lucas, Camila, and their affair. She didn't know how long she walked, minutes, hours, but eventually, she found herself standing in front of Camila's apartment building. The lights were on, and through the window, Elisa could see Camila moving inside, unaware of the storm brewing outside. Anger and grief welled up in Elisa's chest. How could she do this? How could her own sister betray her like this? She wanted to march up to the door, pound on it until Camila answered, and demand an explanation. But her feet wouldn't move. She stood frozen, staring up at the window, the weight of her emotions crushing her. Suddenly, Camila glanced out the window, her eyes locking with Elisa's for a brief second. Elisa's breath caught. She turned quickly, walking away before Camila could react. She wasn't ready for this confrontation. Not yet. By the time she returned home, the house was dark. The kids were in bed, and Lucas was asleep on the couch, the TV flickering in the background. Elisa stood in the doorway, staring at him, her heart heavy with a mix of love and hate. How had they ended up here? How had their marriage, once so full of promise, turned into this nightmare? She couldn't keep pretending, but the thought of confronting Lucas terrified her. What would happen to their family? What would happen to the kids? With a heavy heart, Elisa picked up Lucas's phone again. Her hands were steady now as she unlocked it and scrolled through the messages once more. She needed to see them again, to remind herself that this was real. "I'll see you tomorrow." "I can't wait." "Me neither." "I miss you." What if Elisa finds out? She won't. Just be careful. Careful. They had been careful, hiding their affair right under her nose, making sure she didn't find out. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. Elisa stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone, her mind whirling. She could confront him now, but what about the kids? What about Sophia and Ben? They didn't deserve this. She couldn't keep this secret forever. But for tonight, at least, she needed more time. She locked the phone and set it back on the counter. The truth was coming, but she wasn't ready yet. Elisa's hands trembled as she tightened her grip around the steering wheel, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows on the road ahead. It had been 2 days since she had discovered the full extent of Lucas's affair with her sister, Camila. 2 long, agonizing days filled with sleepless nights and the constant weight of the truth bearing down on her like an anchor. She had thought of nothing else, and now, as she drove to Camila's apartment, she knew she couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. She needed to confront her sister. Her stomach churned as she parked the car outside Camila's building, her pulse quickening with every step toward the entrance. She rehearsed her words in her head, trying to find the right way to confront her without completely losing control. But there was no way to prepare for this. No way to confront your sister about the ultimate betrayal without the flood of emotions threatening to consume you. When she reached Camila's door, her breath hitched in her throat. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorbell, but before she could press it, the door swung open. Camila stood there, looking startled, her eyes widening in surprise. "Elisa? What are you doing here?" For a moment, Elisa said nothing. She stood there, taking in the sight of her sister, the same sister she had grown up with, shared childhood memories with, laughed and cried with. But now, all those memories were tainted, overshadowed by the betrayal that hung between them like a dark cloud. "I know," Elisa said, her voice low but firm. Camila's face paled, and for a split second, Elisa saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, guilt, maybe even shame. "What do you mean?" Camila asked, though the tremble in her voice betrayed her. "Don't play games with me, Camila," Elisa snapped, her anger bubbling to the surface. "I know everything. You and Lucas. I saw the messages. I know about the affair." The color drained from Camila's face completely, and for a moment, she looked as if she might faint. Her mouth opened and closed, as if searching for the right words, but nothing came out. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Camila took a deep breath, stepping aside to let Elisa in. "Come inside," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Elisa stepped over the threshold, her heart pounding in her chest. The apartment was familiar, yet now it felt foreign, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. She had been here so many times before, shared so many moments with her sister in this very space. But now, the warmth and comfort of those memories were gone, replaced by a cold emptiness. Camila gestured toward the couch, but Elisa remained standing, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw clenched. "How long?" she demanded, her voice cracking with the weight of her emotions. "How long has this been going on?" Camila hesitated, avoiding Elisa's gaze. She sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling in her lap. 6 months, she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. "Maybe longer. I don't know exactly when it started." Elisa felt the words like a punch to the gut. 6 months. 6 months of lies, of deceit, of her sister sleeping with her husband behind her back. Her knees felt weak, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse under the weight of it all. "How could you?" Elisa whispered, her voice breaking. "You're my sister. How could you do this to me?" Camila's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head, wiping at her face with trembling hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Elisa. I swear. It just did. I never wanted to hurt you." Elisa let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and hollow. "You never wanted to hurt me? Well, guess what? You did. You destroyed everything, Camila. My marriage, our family. How do you expect me to ever forgive you for this?" "I know," Camila whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I know I ruined everything. I'm so sorry, Elisa. I was jealous, okay? I was jealous of your life, of everything you had with Lucas. And I made a mistake. A horrible mistake." Elisa stared at her sister, her heart pounding in her chest. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in on her. "Jealous?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "You did this because you were jealous?" "I know it sounds ridiculous," Camila sobbed, her hands shaking. "But it's true. I wanted what you had. I wanted the life you had with him. I didn't plan it, Elisa. It just happened." Elisa couldn't believe what she was hearing. The betrayal, the deceit, all because of jealousy? It was too much. Her chest tightened, and for a moment, she felt like she couldn't breathe. She turned away, her eyes filling with tears. She didn't want Camila to see her cry. She didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing just how deeply she had wounded her. "Elisa, please," Camila begged, rising to her feet. "I'm so sorry. I know I messed up. I'll do anything to make it right. Please don't hate me." Elisa spun around, her eyes blazing with fury. "Make it right? How could you possibly make this right, Camila? You slept with my husband. You lied to me. You betrayed me. There's no coming back from that. Camila flinched at her words, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I know there's no excuse for what I did. But I love you, Elisa. You're my sister. Please don't cut me out of your life. The desperation in Camila's voice tugged at something deep inside Elisa, but the anger and betrayal still burned too fiercely. She didn't know if she could ever forgive her. Not after this. I need time, Elisa whispered, her voice cracking. I can't deal with this right now. I need time to think. Camila nodded, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I understand. Take all the time you need. Elisa turned and walked toward the door, her steps heavy, her heart aching with every beat. As she reached for the doorknob, she paused, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Could she ever forgive Camila? Could she ever trust her again? And what about Lucas? What would she do about him? She didn't have the answers. All she knew was that everything she thought she knew about her marriage, about her sister, about her life, had been shattered into a million pieces. And she wasn't sure if it could ever be put back together. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Elisa felt the weight of the confrontation settle heavily on her shoulders. The path ahead was uncertain, full of pain and difficult decisions. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The days following her confrontation with Camila were a blur of silent torment. Elisa moved through the motions of her life like a hollow shell, barely holding herself together. The weight of her discovery hung over her like a suffocating blanket. Every glance at Lucas felt like a punch to the gut, and the image of her sister crying on the couch replayed in her mind, haunting her at every turn. She knew she couldn't avoid Lucas much longer. There was no escaping the truth. She had confronted Camila, but the real reckoning had yet to come. Lucas, her husband of 15 years, the father of her children, had to face her now. She couldn't hide behind her own silence anymore. But the very thought of confronting him made her stomach churn with a mix of dread and fury. One night, after putting the kids to bed, Elisa found herself pacing the living room, wringing her hands, trying to summon the courage to speak. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. Lucas sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, completely unaware of the storm about to break. Elisa's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at him, taking in the man she had once loved so fiercely. How had they gotten here? How had the man who had once been her entire world betrayed her so completely? She felt the familiar burn of tears threatening to spill over, but she forced them back. She had cried enough. Now it was time for answers. "Lucas," she said, her voice shaky but firm. He glanced up, surprised by the serious tone in her voice. "What's up?" he asked, his brow furrowing in concern. Elisa stood frozen for a moment, the words caught in her throat. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind over and over, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to begin. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know about you and Camila." Lucas's face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks in an instant. His hands froze on the phone, and he blinked, as if trying to process her words. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "Don't lie to me," Elisa snapped, her voice breaking with emotion. "I saw the messages. I know about the affair. How long were you planning on keeping this secret from me? Or were you just hoping I'd never find out?" Lucas's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights, frozen in place, his eyes wide with shock. Finally, he let out a shaky breath and dropped his head into his hands. I didn't mean for this to happen," he muttered, his voice muffled by his hands. It just got out of control." Elisa's chest tightened with rage, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Out of control?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You slept with my sister, Lucas. You lied to me, to our children for months. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. A choice you made every single day." Lucas lifted his head, his eyes red with guilt and shame. "You're right," he whispered. "I made a terrible mistake. I wasn't thinking straight. But I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted this to happen." Elisa let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and hollow. Well, congratulations, Lucas.
You did hurt me.
You hurt me in the worst way possible. And you didn't just hurt me. You betrayed our family, our kids. How could you do this to us? Tears filled her eyes as she spoke, the weight of her pain crashing down on her. She had held it together for so long, but now, standing face to face with the man who had broken her heart, she couldn't keep it in any longer. Lucas stood from the couch, stepping toward her with his hands raised in surrender. Elisa, please. Let me explain. Explain what? She interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. That you're sorry? That it was a mistake? I don't want to hear your excuses, Lucas. I want the truth. How long has this been going on? Lucas swallowed hard, his hands dropping to his sides. 6 months, he admitted quietly. It started after that trip to the cabin last summer. Elisa closed her eyes, her heart shattering all over again. The cabin, that was when it had started. That trip where everything had seemed so perfect, where they had laughed and shared moments with the kids by the lake. The betrayal had been right there, under her nose, and she hadn't seen it. She had been blind to the truth, blind to the lies that had been woven around her. And you just what? She asked, her voice shaking. You thought you could hide it forever? You thought I wouldn't find out? Lucas shook his head, his voice cracking. No, I didn't think. I don't know what I was thinking. I was selfish, and I was stupid. I'm so sorry, Elisa. I'll do anything to make this right. Please, just give me a chance to fix this. Elisa stared at him, her heart aching with a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. How could he think that this could be fixed? How could he believe that after everything, they could just go back to the way things were? I don't know if this can be fixed, Lucas, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You destroyed us. You destroyed everything we built, everything we promised each other. Elisa sat in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The early morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft, muted glow over the room, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside her. The house was quiet, too quiet. Lucas had taken the kids to school, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, she was alone with her thoughts. The silence felt oppressive, like it was pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She thought back to the night before, to Lucas's broken confession, and her stomach twisted with a familiar wave of anger and betrayal. She had replayed the conversation in her head countless times, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand how the man she had built her life around could have betrayed her so deeply. But there were no answers, only questions. How long had he been lying to her? How many nights had he come home, kissed her goodnight, and slipped into bed beside her, knowing he had spent the day with her sister? The betrayal cut deeper than any wound she had ever known. It wasn't just the affair. It was the lies, the deceit, the complete destruction of the trust they had once shared. Elisa's thoughts drifted to Camila, her sister. The woman who had grown up alongside her, shared secrets with her, laughed and cried with her. How could Camila have done this? How could she have looked Elisa in the eye, called her family, and then turned around and betrayed her in the worst possible way? The thought of Camila's face, tear-streaked and full of remorse, only made Elisa's anger burn hotter. Remorse wasn't enough. Apologies weren't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. The sound of the front door opening pulled Elisa from her thoughts. Lucas stepped into the kitchen, his expression cautious as he set down his keys. The kids are at school, he said quietly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that hung between them. Elisa didn't respond. She kept her eyes fixed on her coffee, watching as the steam from earlier had long since disappeared, much like her trust in him. Lucas stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment before stepping closer. Elisa, he began softly, I know you're hurting. I know I've hurt you, in ways I can't even begin to fix. But I want to try. Please, let me try. She finally lifted her gaze to meet his, her eyes cold and unreadable. Try, she repeated, her voice flat. What exactly do you think you can do to fix this, Lucas? You think a few therapy sessions are going to erase the fact that you betrayed me? That you slept with my sister? Lucas winced, the weight of her words hitting him hard. No, I don't think it'll erase anything, he admitted. but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn your trust back. To be the husband and father you and the kids deserve." Elisa laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. "The husband and father we deserve," she echoed. "What part of you sneaking around with my sister makes you think you're capable of being either of those things?
You lied to me.
You lied to our children. You destroyed everything." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, his face etched with guilt and frustration. I know I messed up. But I love you, Elisa. I love our family. I don't want to lose you." Her heart ached at his words. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the man standing before her was still the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. But the truth was, that man no longer existed. The man standing before her now was a stranger who had shattered her heart. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," she whispered, her voice breaking. Lucas stepped closer, desperation in his eyes. "Please, Elisa,
Just give me a chance.
let me prove to you that I can change, that I can be better." Elisa shook her head, her hands trembling as she set down the cup of coffee. "I need time," she said softly. "I can't just forgive and forget. I can't just move on like nothing happened." "I don't expect you to," Lucas replied.
I'm not asking for that.
"I'm asking for time. Time to show you that I'm still here, that I'm still fighting for us." Elisa stared at him, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had no idea what the future held, whether they could ever truly rebuild what had been broken. But as much as she wanted to push him away, to shut him out completely, there was a part of her, deep down, that still longed for the life they had once shared. "I need space," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need space to figure this out." Lucas nodded, though the pain in his eyes was clear. "I understand," he whispered. "I'll give you all the space you need. Just don't give up on us, Elisa. Please." She didn't respond. She couldn't. Instead, she turned away, her heart aching with the weight of their shattered lives. As the days passed, the house felt like a war zone, tense, quiet, filled with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. Lucas did his best to be present, to help with the kids, but the distance between him and Elisa grew wider with each passing day. She couldn't look at him without feeling the sharp sting of betrayal, couldn't hear his voice without remembering the lies. And yet, despite everything, there was a small, fragile part of her that wanted to believe things could get better. That maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. But as the days turned into weeks, Elisa began to realize that the road to healing wasn't as simple as she had hoped. The wounds ran deep, deeper than she had ever imagined. And every time she thought about Lucas and Camila, the anger flared up all over again, threatening to consume her. One evening, as she sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, the weight of it all became too much. She felt like she was drowning, suffocated by the pain, the betrayal, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She needed to make a decision. She couldn't keep living in this limbo, couldn't keep pretending that things would magically fix themselves. Something had to change. And as she sat there, tears streaming down her face, Elisa realized that maybe the first step toward healing was admitting that things would never be the same again. Elisa stood at the kitchen sink, watching the rain streak down the window, her heart heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. The house felt suffocating, the silence between her and Lucas stretching on for days, thick with unresolved anger and pain. She could hear the faint sounds of her children in their rooms, Sophia's music blasting through her headphones and Ben's quiet voice as he played with his action figures. They had all been living in this tense, fragile state for weeks now, waiting for something to give.
Lucas had been trying.
She could see that. He had been doing everything in his power to show her that he was committed to repairing the damage. He took on more responsibilities with the kids, planned family activities, even suggested they start counseling together. But no matter what he did, the wall between them remained impenetrable. It wasn't enough. Nothing could erase the betrayal she felt every time she looked at him. The image of him with her sister was burned into her mind, an unforgivable reminder of everything she had lost. And even though she tried to move past it for the sake of the children, Every time Lucas touched her or tried to have a conversation, all she felt was a cold, hollow numbness. The sound of raised voices pulled her from her thoughts. Sophia and Lucas were in the backyard, arguing. It had started with a simple disagreement, but Elisa knew from experience that these arguments never stayed simple for long. She could hear Sophia's voice rising, full of teenage fury, each word sharper than the last. "You ruined everything," Sophia screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "This family was fine until you messed it all up." Lucas, who was normally patient and calm with Sophia, snapped. "You don't understand, Sophia. This is more complicated than you think." "I understand enough," she fired back, her face red with anger. "You're the reason Mom is miserable. You're the reason we're all falling apart." Elisa's heart clenched painfully in her chest. She rushed to the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the handle. By the time she stepped outside, Sophia had stormed off, and Lucas stood there, looking utterly defeated. For a moment, Elisa didn't move. She just stood there, staring at Lucas, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to feel. The rain fell softly around them, dampening the tension but doing nothing to wash away the overwhelming sense of despair that hung in the air. Lucas turned to her, his expression pleading. "Elisa, please don't let this be the end. We can fix this." "I know we can." Elisa swallowed hard, her throat tight with unshed tears. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that they could somehow repair the damage, but deep down, she wasn't sure if that was even possible. "How, Lucas?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "How do we fix something that's already broken beyond repair?" Lucas stepped closer, desperation etched in every line of his face. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll keep going to therapy, I'll give you space, whatever you need. Just don't give up on us." Elisa felt the familiar ache in her chest, the constant push and pull between wanting to believe him and knowing that the damage might be too deep to heal. She wanted to scream, to cry, to tell him that it wasn't fair, that none of this was fair. But instead, she simply shook her head, her heart breaking all over again. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Lucas," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I have anything left to give." Lucas's face crumbled at her words, but he didn't argue. He knew that this wasn't something he could fix with promises or apologies. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of everything they had lost. Later that night, after putting the kids to bed, Elisa found herself sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television. The house was quiet, but her mind was loud, filled with 1,000 thoughts racing in every direction. She couldn't keep living like this, in limbo, unsure of what the future held, unsure of whether her marriage could survive the damage that had been done. Sophia's words echoed in her mind, sharp and painful. "You're the reason Mom is miserable." Was she miserable? Was that what her children saw when they looked at her? A woman broken by betrayal, too weak to leave, too scared to stay? She didn't know what to do. Every path forward seemed to lead to more pain, more uncertainty. If she stayed, would things ever truly get better? Could she ever look at Lucas without seeing the lies, the betrayal? And if she left, what would that mean for their children? For their family? The sound of footsteps broke her train of thought, and she looked up to see Lucas standing in the doorway. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn, as if the weight of their crumbling marriage was physically taking its toll on him. "Elisa," he began, his voice hesitant. "I've been thinking maybe we should try a separation."
Just to give us some space.
"Maybe it will help." Elisa stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. A separation. It was something she had thought about, but hearing the words come from Lucas's mouth made it all feel so real, so final. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if space is enough." Lucas nodded, his eyes filled with sadness. "I just don't want to lose you," he said softly. "But if this is what you need," Elisa felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. "I don't know what I need," she admitted, her voice cracking. I just want the pain to stop." The chapter ends with Elisa sitting in the quiet darkness, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. A breaking point has been reached, and now she must decide whether to fight for her marriage or to let go of the life she once knew. Elisa sat in the parking lot outside the lawyer's office, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded in her chest, a dull ache that hadn't subsided since Lucas's suggestion of a separation. She had agreed, at least in theory, that they needed space. But the reality of sitting in front of a divorce lawyer felt like crossing an invisible line she wasn't sure she was ready for. She stared at the glass doors in front of her, the sign that read Law Offices of Mitchell and Davis, glaring back at her. This wasn't how her life was supposed to go. She wasn't supposed to be the woman sitting outside a lawyer's office, contemplating the end of her marriage. But then again, she wasn't supposed to be the woman whose husband betrayed her with her own sister either. For the past few days, Lucas had given her space, true to his word. He had been staying at a friend's house, leaving her and the children to navigate this strange new reality. And although the house felt quieter, the silence weighed heavier than ever. Without Lucas there, it felt as though something essential had been ripped away. But Elisa couldn't figure out if it was him she missed, or just the idea of the life they had built together. With a deep breath, she finally stepped out of the car. The walk to the office felt like it took an eternity. Each step felt heavier than the last. The woman who greeted her inside was friendly, but all Elisa could hear was the roaring in her own mind, the questions, the doubts, the guilt. She sat down in the waiting room, her fingers nervously tapping against her thigh. Her heart raced with indecision. Should she go through with it? Was this the right path? Before she could overthink it any further, the receptionist called her name, and she was led into a small office where a neatly dressed lawyer sat behind a large wooden desk. "Mrs. Anderson, it's a pleasure to meet you," the lawyer greeted her warmly. "I understand you're considering legal separation or divorce?" Elisa nodded, though her throat felt tight.
Yes, I'm
not sure what I'm ready for," she admitted. Her voice sounded foreign, distant, even to her own ears. The lawyer smiled kindly. "That's completely understandable. Many people feel uncertain at this stage. We can discuss your options, and there's no pressure to make a decision today." As the lawyer began explaining the legal process, Elisa felt like she was floating above the conversation, disconnected from the reality of what was happening. This was her life they were talking about, her marriage, her family. And yet, everything felt surreal, like it was happening to someone else. "Do you have any questions so far?" the lawyer asked. Elisa blinked, trying to pull herself back to the present. "I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm ready for this," she said softly. "My husband suggested a separation, but I don't know if that's enough." The lawyer nodded, her expression sympathetic. "It's normal to feel conflicted. Many couples try separation as a step toward figuring out if they want to work things out or move forward with divorce. It gives you space to evaluate the relationship without the pressure of a final decision." Elisa let the words sink in, but they didn't offer the clarity she so desperately sought. "And if I decide? If we decide that it's over, what happens then?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The lawyer leaned forward, her tone gentle. "If you choose to pursue a divorce, we'll help guide you through the process, property division, custody arrangements for your children, and any other legal matters that need to be resolved. It's never an easy decision, but it's about finding the path that's healthiest for you and your family." Elisa nodded, her chest tightening. Custody arrangements. The very thought of splitting time with her children, of dividing their lives, made her stomach churn. How had things come to this? Just as the lawyer began to explain more details, Elisa's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw who it was. Camila. Her fingers hovered over the phone, tempted to ignore it, but something made her swipe to answer. She stood up, excusing herself, and stepped into the hallway. "Elisa." Camila's voice was shaky on the other end. "Please don't hang up. I need to talk to you." Elisa's stomach turned. The sound of her sister's voice stirred up the familiar wave of anger and betrayal, but there was something different this time, an exhaustion, a brokenness that mirrored her own. "I'm at the lawyer's office, Camila," Elisa said quietly, her voice cold. "What do you want?" "I know you probably hate me," Camila began, her voice barely above a whisper. And I don't blame you, but I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. For everything. I never meant for it to go this far. Elisa's grip tightened on the phone. You didn't mean for it to go this far, she repeated, incredulity thick in her voice. Camila, you slept with my husband. What did you think would happen? There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of Camila's quiet sobs. I know I've ruined everything, Elisa. I've ruined us. I've ruined your family. I can't take back what I did, but I don't want to lose you forever. Elisa closed her eyes, the weight of her sister's words pressing down on her. Part of her wanted to scream, to hang up the phone, and never speak to Camila again. But another part of her, the part that remembered the sister she had grown up with, the one who had shared her childhood and all her secrets, couldn't ignore the pain in Camila's voice. I don't know if I can forgive you, Elisa said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at you without seeing the betrayal. I understand, Camila whispered, but I hope that someday, we can find a way to be sisters again. Elisa didn't respond. She couldn't. Her emotions were too raw, too conflicted. She ended the call, feeling more lost than ever. The conversation had left her shaken, and as she returned to the lawyer's office, the weight of everything she was about to lose, her marriage, her family, even her sister, settled heavily on her shoulders. By the time she left the office, she hadn't made a final decision. The lawyer's advice echoed in her mind, but no legal document could tell her what her heart truly wanted. As Elisa drove home, her thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and pain. Could she forgive Lucas? Could she forgive Camila? And even if she did, would their family ever be whole again? The chapter ends with Elisa arriving home, standing in front of the house that no longer feels like her home. She knows that a decision is imminent, one that will change everything forever. Elisa stood in front of the mirror, her reflection a ghost of the woman she used to be. The faint light from the bathroom window cast soft shadows on her face, highlighting the weariness etched into her skin. She barely recognized the person staring back at her. The past few months had chipped away at her piece by piece, until all that remained were fragments of the life she had once known. A life she had once cherished. Her fingers brushed against her hair, the same way they had countless times before, but this time it felt different. Final, as if she were preparing for something she couldn't fully understand. She had just come from the lawyer's office, the papers resting on the dining table, waiting for her signature. The weight of that single sheet of paper was heavier than anything she had ever carried. In her hand, she held the power to end her marriage, to shatter what little remained of the family she had fought so hard to keep together. She knew that signing the papers would bring a certain kind of relief, freedom, perhaps, but it would also bring pain, a deep, irrevocable loss. The end of something she had invested her heart and soul in for so many years. She had already lost so much: her trust in Lucas, her faith in her sister, and, in many ways, her own sense of self. But as she stood there, staring at her reflection, Elisa realized something. Despite the broken pieces, despite the heartache and betrayal, she was still standing. She had survived. She had navigated through the darkest moments of her life, and somehow, she was still here, still breathing. The sound of the front door opening echoed down the hallway, pulling her from her thoughts. Lucas was home. Elisa took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She had made her decision, but that didn't make the conversation any easier. She walked out of the bathroom, her heart pounding in her chest as she made her way to the living room where Lucas stood, his face pale and drawn. They locked eyes for a brief moment, and Elisa saw the guilt, the sorrow etched into his features. He had been trying, she knew that. He had been patient, giving her the space she asked for, attending therapy, and doing everything in his power to prove that he could change. But even with all of that effort, the chasm between them remained. "Did you go to the lawyer's office?" Lucas asked, his voice tentative. Elisa nodded, her throat tight. "I did." Lucas swallowed hard, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hope. "And what did you decide?" Elisa hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it, the moment of truth. She stepped closer to him, her heart aching with the knowledge of what she was about to say. "I signed the papers," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I haven't filed them yet." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas's face fell, his shoulders slumping as if the wind had been knocked out of him. He sat down on the couch, burying his face in his hands. "So, this is it," he murmured, his voice muffled. "This is how it ends." Elisa walked over and sat beside him, leaving a small space between them. "I don't know, Lucas," she admitted, her voice raw. "I've been trying to figure out what's best for me for the kids. And honestly, I don't have all the answers. I don't know if we can ever get back to where we were. But what I do know is that things can't stay the way they are." Lucas looked up at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I never wanted this," he whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you or the kids. I was selfish, and I know that now. But I love you, Elisa. I love our family." Elisa's chest tightened at his words. She had heard them before, so many times. And while part of her wanted to believe him, to cling to the hope that they could somehow rebuild what had been broken, another part of her knew that love wasn't enough. "Not anymore. I believe you love me," she said softly. "But love alone can't fix this. I've been carrying this pain for months, and I can't just pretend that everything is okay. We've both changed, Lucas. We're not the same people we were before all of this happened." Lucas's face crumpled, and he reached for her hand. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I'll wait. I'll keep going to therapy. I'll fight for us. Please, just give me a chance." Elisa closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his hand on hers. A part of her wanted to take that chance, to believe in the possibility of healing. But the truth was, she didn't know if she had the strength to keep fighting. "Not anymore. I don't want to hurt you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I need to find myself again. I need to know who I am without all of this weighing me down." Lucas's grip tightened on her hand. "So, what does that mean? Is this the end?" Elisa shook her head slowly. "I don't know. Maybe this is the end of us, as we were. But maybe it's the beginning of something new. I need space, Lucas. I need time. And maybe, after everything, we can find a way to rebuild. But right now, I just need to be on my own." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of finality. Lucas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and understanding. He nodded slowly, his hand slipping away from hers. "If that's what you need," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet resignation. "I'll give it to you." Elisa felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was tinged with sadness. She knew that this wasn't the ending she had imagined for them, but it was the ending they needed. She stood up, her legs shaky, and walked to the table where the divorce papers sat. Without a word, she picked them up and tore them in half. The sound of the paper ripping was sharp, final. Lucas watched her in silence, his expression unreadable. "This doesn't mean I'm staying," she said quietly. "But it means I'm not leaving."
Not yet.
Lucas nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. Elisa turned toward the window, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded into the horizon. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with pain and healing in equal measure. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to rebuild her life, piece by piece. And as the darkness settled around her, Elisa realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter written on her own terms.